Before the darkness swallows the truth, make sure you're subscribed. Hit that notification bell, or you might find yourself lost in the shadows of the next case we uncover. Leave a comment below if you believe some secrets are better left buried. Now, let's descend. The air in the execution chamber of the South Dakota State Penitentiary didn't just feel cold. It felt heavy, like it was saturated with the weight of 20 years of silence. Elias Thorne sat strapped to the gurney, the leather restraints biting into his pale, thin wrists. Outside, the wind howled across the plains, but inside, the only sound was the rhythmic hiss of the ventilation system and the steady, haunting pulse of the heart monitor. Elias wasn't a large man, but the shadow he cast over the American Midwest was gargantuan. They called him the Shepherd of Silence, a man convicted of the meticulous, surgical abduction of 7 people across 3 states in the late 90s. District Attorney Marcus Vane stood behind the glass, his knuckles white as he gripped the railing. He had spent his entire career chasing Elias. He had been the one to find the bone gardens behind the derelict farmhouse in 2004. He had seen the Polaroids Elias kept, images of victims who looked like they were merely sleeping, staged in elaborate, Victorian-style tea parties. But there was one thing Marcus never found: the body of his own sister, Clara, who vanished 6 months before Elias was caught. As the warden stepped forward to ask for his final statement, the room went deathly quiet. Elias didn't look at the witnesses. He didn't look at the priest. He turned his head slowly, his sunken eyes locking onto Marcus through the glass. A faint, jagged smile pulled at the corners of his lips, a smile that looked more like a scar. He leaned toward the microphone, his voice a dry, gravelly whisper that seemed to vibrate in Marcus's very marrow. "The 7th teacup was never empty, Marcus," Elias breathed. "You spent 20 years looking for a grave, but you never thought to check the foundation of the house you bought to forget her." Marcus felt the floor tilt. The house he lived in, the craftsman bungalow he'd purchased 3 years after the trial to find peace, was the very property where Elias had worked as a landscaper a decade before the murders. The warden gave the signal. The lethal chemicals began their crawl through the 4 lines. But as Elias's eyes rolled back, Marcus realized with a jolt of pure horror that the monster wasn't taking a secret to the grave. He had just invited Marcus into it. The moment the flat line echoed through the observation room, Marcus Vane wasn't thinking about justice. He was thinking about the floorboards. He sprinted from the penitentiary, the heavy iron gates clanging shut behind him like a final exclamation point on Elias Thorne's life. The 3-hour drive back to his suburban home was a blur of rain-slicked pavement and the memory of Elias's yellowed teeth. The 7th teacup. It was a taunt, a riddle, or a confession. When Marcus reached his driveway, the craftsman bungalow he'd called a sanctuary for 15 years looked like a tomb. He burst through the front door, the scent of cedar and old paper, usually so comforting, now smelling of decay. He grabbed a sledgehammer from the garage, his breath coming in ragged, panicked bursts. He didn't start in the basement. He went to the kitchen, to the breakfast nook where he drank his coffee every morning, directly above the crawlspace Elias had renovated back in the 90s. The first blow of the hammer shattered the hardwood. By the 4th strike, the subflooring gave way, revealing a hollow void that shouldn't have been there. Beneath the insulation, tucked between the joists, sat a weathered, wooden box. Inside was a single, porcelain teacup, stained with a dark, dried residue. But it wasn't a body. It was a map, a hand-drawn schematic of the very prison Marcus had just left. As Marcus stared at the map, his phone buzzed. It was the warden. His voice was trembling, stripped of its usual professional coldness. "Marcus, you need to get back here. We just started the post-mortem on Thorne. The medical examiner, he found something."
"What?"
Marcus whispered, his eyes tracing a red line on the map that led directly to the prison's high-security infirmary. "It wasn't just a heart attack from the injection, Marcus. Thorne had a surgical scar on his abdomen that wasn't there during his last physical. When they opened him up, they didn't find organs. They found a series of glass vials sewn into his intestinal tract. And Marcus, one of them is missing. We have a containment breach." The shepherd didn't come here to die. He came here to deliver something. Suddenly, the lights in Marcus's house flickered and died. In the sudden, suffocating darkness, he heard a sound that made his blood turn to ice. The soft, rhythmic clinking of a porcelain spoon against a teacup, coming from the shadows of his own hallway. The clinking stopped. In the silence of the blackout, Marcus's own heartbeat sounded like a hammer against an anvil. He fumbled for his service weapon, his fingers slick with sweat. "Who's there?" he bellowed, but the only answer was the low, rhythmic hum of a cellular device vibrating on the kitchen island. He swiped the screen, the blue light illuminating a grainy, live feed video. It was the prison infirmary. The medical examiner was slumped against the wall, his eyes wide and vacant, as a figure in a guard's uniform systematically emptied the glass vials from Elias's chest into the facility's water filtration intake. Elias Thorne hadn't been a serial killer. He was a carrier. The tea parties weren't just macabre rituals. They were controlled biological experiments. The seventh cup wasn't Clara's grave. It was the incubation period. Marcus lunged toward the hallway, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the dark until it landed on a figure sitting in his high-backed armchair. It was a woman, her hair grayed by decades of shadow, her face a roadmap of trauma. "Clara?" Marcus gasped, the gun trembling in his hand. She looked up, her eyes glazed with a terrifying, milky film. She wasn't a captive. She was the masterpiece. "He said you'd come looking for the foundation, Marcus," she whispered, her voice a hollow echo of the sister he remembered. "But the foundation isn't the house. It's the bloodline." The realization hit him like a physical blow. Elias hadn't spent 20 years in silence. He'd spent 20 years refining a pathogen that required a specific genetic marker to stabilize: Marcus's DNA. The map in the floorboards wasn't an escape route for Elias. It was a lure for Marcus. By breaking into that box, by breathing in the dust of the dried residue in that cup, Marcus had become the final delivery system. As sirens began to wail in the distance, Marcus felt a sudden, searing heat beneath his skin. He looked at his reflection in the hallway mirror and saw the jagged, scar-like smile beginning to form on his own lips. The shepherd of silence had finally spoken, and the world was about to scream. They thought the execution was the end of the horror. But 3 days later, the first symptoms appeared in 3 different states, all carried by the very investigators who had closed the case. If you think this story was intense, you're not ready for the next one, hit subscribe so you don't miss it. Would you like me to develop a new mystery for you to solve?